We're on lesson 1 of chapter 10, which we're going to analyze surveys and samples. First, we're going to classify sampling methods. Then we're going to identify a potentially biased sample. Then we're going to identify potentially biased questions. Usually the reason we do surveys and questions is because we want to know information about the population. That's all a population really is. It's a group of people who you want to know more about. So it could be all the girls at your school, or it could be all the runners at a track meet, or all the people in your city, or all the people in your state. And for the last two ones, the city and your state, it'd be very difficult to go around and ask everybody their opinion about something. So that's why we use samples. Samples are supposed to represent the entire population. And we know that there's some good samples and there's some bad samples. The vocab word I want you to learn today is a biased sample. A biased sample is a sample that is not representative of the population. We're going to go through some types of samples today, and some of these are going to be more likely to be biased, and some are less likely to be biased. The first one we're going to focus on is the random sample. And this one is what it implies. It completely randomly chooses people to be in the sample from the population. It doesn't follow a pattern. It just maybe uses like a random selector or some kind of organizer where it randomly picks people from the population to answer a question. And then that would be my sample. That one is not likely to be biased. It's usually the most preferred method of sampling because you know that there's no bias in choosing the people, and it most likely represents the population very well. Stratified random samples are pretty similar except for the stratified part, which means to break it up into groups. For example, if I was asking what people's favorite shampoo was, I know that men and women typically like different shampoos. So maybe what I would do is I would break the population in half. I'd have men over here and women over here. Then I'm going to randomly choose men to be in my sample over here. Then I'll randomly choose women to be in my sample over here. Then I can compare the two samples and see if there's a difference between men and women for favorite shampoo. So we're still randomly choosing people, but we're breaking them off into groups. So if you want to write in your notes that stratified means to break off into groups. And since it's a random sampling method, it's not that likely to be biased. It's usually a pretty good sampling method. A systemic sample then follows a rule. And that rule could be peoples whose last name starts with G or R. And let's say our rule was people that are over 6 feet tall, which would be these people here. So this would become my sample. And let's say my question about the population was, what is your favorite sport? Well, since these people all are tall, they might like basketball more than the rest of these people, so this actually would be a potentially biased situation. So systemics aren't always perfect. Sometimes they're okay, but when it's a question like that, that's going to cause some problems. So we've written one word for this one, which would be groups. Systemic, you would say, follows a rule. Convenient samples, I would write down as a lazy sample. It picks people to be in the sample that are the easiest to get to. So for example, if I'm over here, and I really don't want to go all the way over here to ask these people, I'm just going to pick these people to be in my group for a sample, and I'll just ask them what they think. That could very well be biased. The people over here might have more things in common with each other than they do with the people over here, and that's probably why they're by each other. So the convenience sample is very likely to be biased. The last one to discuss is a self-selected sample, meaning that the people actually come forward and choose themselves to be in the sample. So this person would come forward, and this person would come forward. This is also very likely to be biased, because you're basically splitting them off into groups of people who really care and people who don't care as much. So the people who actually come forward, they're probably going to have very, very strong opinions, much stronger opinions than the people who don't come forward. So you're really only going to get the very angry people or the very, very pleased people. So now let's move on to classifying sampling methods. Since the owners of a company with several factories conduct a survey to determine whether employees are informed about safety regulations. At each factory, 50 employees are chosen at random to complete a survey. Identify the population and classify the sampling method. Well, if we're looking for a population, we're looking at several factories here, and we're looking at the employees. So it looks like the employees at all the factories. And that was too large of a population to ask everybody. So we're going to label that as the population. So what's the sample that they choose? Well, it looks like they went to each factory, and then at each factory they chose 50 employees at random. So if you're going back to our first page here, the random sample chooses people randomly, But the stratified random sample breaks people into groups first, then chooses them. And that's what this looks like here. They broke them into groups by factory, then they chose them randomly, 50 at each factory. So we're going to call this one the stratified random sampling. Now we're going to see if we can identify a potentially biased sample. So it says for the previous example that we just looked at, suppose the owners question at random from one factory. Is the method likely to result in a biased sample? Well, we mentioned before that this is a pretty good word with sampling. Random is always good. So you might be tempted to say that this is a not biased sample. But we see here that it's only at one factory, and that changes things because this one might have a very good boss, whereas all the other factories have a very bad bosses, or maybe the other way around. So we are going to say likely biased because they are only doing the survey at one factory, while the population was the employees at all factories. So the people at one factory can't represent all the employees at all the factories. That's what makes it biased. Now we're going to see if we can identify potentially biased questions. So it says tell whether the question is potentially biased and explain your answer. If the question is not potentially biased, restate the question so that it is not. So here's our question that we're asking in the survey. Don't you agree that the voting age should be lowered to 16 because many 16-year-olds are responsible and informed? And here's the rule for identifying these biased questions. If they give reasoning for either side, that usually makes it a biased question. You're trying to convince them, not really ask them. So first of all, when they ask you, don't you agree, that's kind of very much leading them in the wrong direction. But it's also this part especially, because many 16-year-olds are responsible and informed. That's very much an opinion. That's going to try to sway the vote to people saying yes. So if we're going to rewrite our question, we would say, do you agree that the voting age should be lowered to 16? And we'll just leave it at that. It's for them to decide whether that's good or not. Here's the second question. Do you think that the city should risk an increase in pollution by allowing expansion of the Northern Industrial Park? This one might be a little bit more difficult to tell. They say that sounds like a pretty good question. But here it's kind of stating the reason for one side again. It's talking about that risking an increase in pollution. It doesn't say any of the benefits of expanding the Northern Industrial Park. Maybe that'll provide more power for the city. But the question doesn't say that. It only says an argument in one side. So that's what's going to make it biased. And if we're going to rewrite this question, we're going to leave that part out. So we'd say, do you think the city should allow expansion of the Northern Industrial Park? And we'll leave it at that. We're not going to try to sway them with our question. Otherwise, we're not getting an honest answer. Usually people get kind of swayed when there's questions worded like this.